debates across the political spectrum, even while people in other countries repudiate it. I have experienced the pain of separation from loved ones when I left my wife and our 5 young children and went to Afghanistan with the U.S. Army. I've experienced the grief of tragic death as I supported more than a dozen dignified transfer ceremonies of U.S. service members killed in action. During my time in uniform, I saw blood pour from the bodies of soldiers. I gave pints of my own blood to keep the wounded from bleeding out. I delivered the knock at midnight to some unsuspecting household as part of a casualty notification team. I held mothers and young widows in my arms as they sobbed and screamed. In sum, I understand the high costs that come with boots on the ground troop deployments. No politician wants to bear responsibility for sending more U.S. service members than necessary into situations where they might get killed. Who wants U.S. blood on their hands or tormenting their conscience? From this perspective, I can understand why drones appear to be an attractive alternative. Still, drone killing leaves me with intellectual disbelief and moral dis-ease. As I behold U.S. leaders choosing what they see as short-term benefit without considering long-term consequence. While deployed, I lived under drones, some unarmed surveillance drones, others armed with hellfire. I saw them in the sky and on the runway at Kandahar Airfield. As a military chaplain, one of my duties was to support the dignified transfer ceremonies, a military tradition performed on the flight line, the runway, to honor the war dead as their remains leave the combat zone to the United States. In the ceremony, a flag-draped casket is carried by soldiers across the tarmac up the ramp of a C-17 Air Force cargo plane. The soldiers salute, the chaplain reads the names, ages, and hometowns of the fallen and shares a few words about the surviving family. Taps is played on a bugle. The ceremony says this life mattered. For each ceremony, I was granted special access to the flight line, and those were the times I would see the drones. Parked, sometimes taking off, sometimes landing. When drones landed unarmed, I wondered, was it just a surveillance mission, or did it just deliver death by hellfire? I wondered, who did we kill? What was their name? Where did they live, and who had loved them? And was their death necessary? In Afghanistan, I learned the U.S. fired hellfire from armed drones to kill anyone who met some ambiguous standard of reasonable suspicion. Someone spotted digging a hole in a road was a legitimate target for a drone strike. Where is the necessity? Less than a month after I arrived, a grandmother who lived across the border in Pakistan was out gathering okra in a field when she was apparently killed by a U.S. drone strike. I say apparently because official sources claim they killed militants that day. Now, I didn't see her or anyone else die. All I saw were the drones taking off and landing. Only months later did I read reports about the incident and hear the testimony of 13-year-old Zubair Rehman describe how he saw his grandmother blown to bits by missiles that came from the sky, and how he now lives in fear of blue skies, because that is when the drones fly. In those moments on the runway, I was confronted with 2 stark realities: the dignified transfer ceremony that honored, personalized, and humanized the death of our own, and the armed drone strike that dishonored, depersonalized, and dehumanized the other. The ceremony said our lives matter. The drone strikes said their lives don't. Eventually, I concluded our drone strikes were harming innocent people in a manner that seemed both disproportionate, unnecessary, in a type of warfare with no reasonable probability of success. In short, it did not constitute just war. Moreover, I found this type of warfare betrays deeply held military values like courage, honor, and integrity. Regulations that govern the chaplaincy obligate us as chaplains to speak with a prophetic voice against moral turpitude in conflict with Army values. It was my job to be a moral compass. I became concerned that my silence would constitute betrayal of these values and a tacit endorsement of killer drones. So I decided to speak up and preached a sermon in a chapel at Kandahar Airfield, challenging the morality of drone warfare and exposing the lie. The military reacted harshly. I was investigated, officially reprimanded for politically inflammatory speech, and released from active duty for retraining. Drone warfare has spilled blood across the globe, too much blood, and I see no convincing evidence that all this bloodshed has made our citizenry safer, or that these drone wars have any chance of success. Instead, they seem to have generated more hatred and dragged us into endless war. This kind of killing is morally injurious, both to service members and the citizenry. Since the U.S. has developed this new capacity to kill, the threshold for the U.S. use of lethal force has decreased. This has been called the moral hazard of drone warfare. Has this bloodshed been necessary to stop continuing imminent threats to U.S. persons? I doubt that it has. Can it be justified by other just war criteria that we've heard about? I doubt that it can. Most people killed have been Muslims in other countries, and they number, as we've seen, in the thousands. Some U.S. citizens have been killed. We're told unintentionally, except for at least one case, which I think we need to talk about in this space today, the case of Antal Lt, an imam born in New Mexico, educated in Colorado and Washington, D.C., and died in Yemen. The U.S. could have captured Anwar. Instead, the U.S. employed a decapitation strategy and hunted him down in a find, fix, finish mission utilizing Predator drones and executed him with Hellfire missiles. His death was celebrated by some in Washington as a jackpot. We need to consider the negative strategic consequences, and this is the moral disbelief, the intellectual disbelief that I struggle with, that there's no evidence that this type of killing is helping us as a nation increase national security. The negative strategic consequences of the decision to kill Anwar al-Awlaki are huge. The U.S. did nothing to discredit him or his message, which is all over the internet, his sermons, his audio CDs, and killing him has only made him a martyr in the audience's eyes and elevated him into a legendary status, validating and strengthening his narrative. These are not only my words, they're the words of an analysis by Charles M. McNeil, a major in the U.S. Air Force, who wrote a paper on the strategic costs of killing Anwar al-Awlaki. How can we call this kind of warfare successful? Anwar was killed while I was serving as a military chaplain. And sadly, the U.S. seems to have learned nothing from this failed strategy of decapitation. Since then, as we have heard about, drone war has expanded and seems to be accepted and embraced by many citizens as the quick fix, low-cost solution to complex threats and foreign policy challenges. The U.S. seems to accept drone warfare in part due to the absence of moral outrage and moral leadership. For my part, I've tried to speak out and offer moral critique from a pulpit in Afghanistan, and then eventually resigning my commission as an officer in protest to U.S. drone policy. My denomination has also taken a stand of conscience, although we are not, as a whole, pacifists and recognize there are times when lethal force may be necessary. We do repudiate aggressive and preventive wars, the disproportionate use of force, covert wars, and targeting that includes a high risk to civilians. Drone war is all of these things. Recently, my denomination joined with 20 others in signing a statement to the Trump administration. Other religious communities have not yet done so, and in their silence, I believe, enable the gross consolidation of power of the executive branch and the permanent drone war waged in our name. Stop here.
So this seminary, I'm an alumni of this seminary, and I started seminary on 9/11 at this center. And it was the first day that I felt fear as a Muslim living in the United States. When the local imam from the Hartford Mosque came in the afternoon of that day and said, for the sisters, they call Muslim women sisters, if you need to get anything at the supermarket, the store, or whatever, please call the mosque. We'll come and do it for you because we are concerned about your safety. And not once did I ever think, living in the United States as an immigrant from Trinidad of Indian descent, coming to the United States, the land of liberty, freedom, and anything possible, and justice and safety and security. I sort of grew up living that way in the United States for over 28 years. The next month after 9/11, my security officer came up to me and he said to me, Major Hosein, I'm not sure if you've really thought about this, but your military colleagues may not trust you, and your Muslim community may not trust you. And I'm like, okay, add in injury, insult to injury here. And so my whole world got turned around. The entire Muslim population in the U.S., we've been living under this cloud, and all because Osama bin Laden, individual, took on the responsibility of waging war on our nation. And within Islam, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the rules of warfare according to Islam. And so bin Laden, as an individual, individuals can't wage war. It has to be a nation state, or in olden days, the caliphate, or a collective to wage war. And to wage war, you can't do surprise attack like he did, just going into, just attacking us. Driving planes into a civilian structure where there are civilians and not combatants, and they're non-combatants. So bin Laden really created this unrest for the global population, living especially in the United States and globally. Man, since God created man, we've been fighting one another for the quest for survival, for security. Our complex characteristics such as greed, ambition, and lust have led us through generations to bear the teeth and spur against our kind in order to keep land, power, and wealth. And war and the art of it has therefore been a handy tool for man to either destroy or rebuild. And so there is a perspective of legitimacy that religions of all form gives to war. And within Islam, and at the same time, it doesn't justify bloodshed. So within Islam, there's this, the rule of war. And the concept of jihad is the way that one reflects upon. So the word jihad means to struggle. And it was to struggle in being a better person, being a better human being, being kind to your neighbors, your family, and your community. However, and let me just caveat this, the basis for just war theories goes back to the early time in the Islamic history, the 6th century, where the Muslims were being persecuted in the town, the city that they lived in, Mecca, and they had to flee to Medina for their safety, their well-being. And at that point, the jihad living in Mecca with this new religion coming on the ground, finding sort of hiding and practicing because the local, the major tribes were confronted that this new religion was going to usurp their power. So the struggle was to have faith in God and practice your religion. However, when the community migrated to Medina, it was then jihad turned into the struggle for self-defense. And however, with multiple rules on self-defense. So the Quran is the base source on how Muslims engaged in jihad, and the source on the guidance and how to do it. The Prophet Muhammad, he was the prophet, he was the leader, he was ended up being the general of the military. And so, within Islam, and according to the Quran, fighting should only be in self-defense and not only legitimate, but it's also mandatory for Muslims. And so, for example, if you can't engage, it is best to then try to talk, to dialogue, to find all means possible, and war is the last case. And it's not just because, as bin Laden said, no one's listening to me, I want to get my way, I want the West to not mistreat the Muslims across the globe, and took it upon himself. In his situation, what if he had taken more reflection, tried to find different ways to protest, work through the UN, instead of waging war, which he didn't have the right to do in the first place. And so offensive conflict, on the other hand, is greatly discouraged. And there's no basis to fight people of other religions or cultures on religious or moral grounds, except when they in turn are hostile and belligerent. So if I am attacked or a nation is attacked, then that is the justification to go to war. However, even in that situation, how could you prevent war? And the intention is to prevent war and live peacefully. But if you can't and the enemy is attacking you, then you are, within Islamic doctrine, permitted to then return force. However, even in the force, in returning the force, there's also limitations. And so jihad is only valid when all other means of ending oppressions have failed. So no individual or group can justify waging war in the name of Islam against any perceived enemy except through legitimate authority of governments. And it appeared, so in the Muslim memory, 1492 is like a critical part of the sort of the immediate breaking up of the caliphate, the Muslim control and authority, and sort of self-rule. And that continued onwards till World War I, where even at that point, there were now a whole lot of nation states. And each nation state had its own authority, and there was no I guess, central authority anymore for the Muslim community to adhere to. So the basic principles of fighting in the Quran is that communities should be treated as one's own. So I also need to have, or Muslims need to have empathy for the enemy. And war should happen as quickly as possible. And if the enemy immediately raises the white flag for we surrender, then even if the Muslims have the advantage to decimate the enemy, they should cease and stop right there and start negotiating with peace talks. So there's this one, there's the 10 rules that the Prophet gave to his companions at the time that is passed down through the years, and it says, O people, I charge you with 10 rules. Learn them well. Stop, O people, that I may give you 10 rules for the guidance in the battlefield. Do not commit treachery or deviate from the right path. You must not mutilate dead bodies, neither kill a child, nor a woman, nor an aged man. Bring no harm to the trees, nor burn them with fire, especially those that are fruitful. Slay not any of the enemy's flocks, save for your food. You are likely to pass by people who have devoted their lives to monastic services. Leave them alone. Those are the monks, the priests. And this guidance have been the way that Muslims have moved forward in waging wars. This is the top. This is the baseline. However, throughout the centuries, we know in the cloud of war, the fog of war, things have deviated, but this is the guidance for Muslims. And so, so because Islam views war as only legitimate in defense, on several occasions, the Quran explicitly commands Muslims to fight only the enemy. This means that only combatants are to be fought. Non-combatants, such as the women, children, clergy, the aged, insane, farmers, serfs, the blind, and so on, should not be killed in war. Also, an enemy combatants must not be subjected to torture, burning alive, maiming, mutilation, nor should fighters deploy weapons that cause unnecessary injury and destruction. Islam, therefore, not only draws a clear distinction between combatants and non-combatants, but also strictly prohibits any forms of ungodly treatment to the enemy. And so I'm going to go back to when bin Laden attacked the United States. His destruction violated, he used, we'll call the planes going into the building, the destruction of the building, the destruction of people, the lives, the start of this war. He had no legitimacy at all. So when I think about drone warfare, within Islam, it is clearly not permissible. And I'm not a scholar, but it's for my interpretation, because my first experience when I heard of germ warfare, my last assignment, I was at Special Operations Command, and my job was, we created it. My job in the military was a personnel officer and a logistics officer. And because I was training to be a Muslim chaplain at Hartford Seminary, I was able to transfer those skills when I got to my command, and I became the cultural engagement officer, and my job was to do workshops and help educate my colleagues about Islam and the multiple diverse cultures of Muslims across the globe, and also to reach out to academics in think tanks, universities, where we could gain expertise on how better to, I guess, deal with the population in Afghanistan and Iraq at the time. And I wasn't focused on the war-making side. I was, in my mind, I've always been a peacenik in the Army, and that sounds like a contradiction, but I hope to have been a veteran of no wars, because in 2000, up until 2002, our posture, U.S. posture was a defensive posture versus an offensive posture, that we needed to be attacked first before we would attack. And so my colleague showed me a video of this target in Afghanistan, and they said, watch this, wait for the moment. And I'm like, what am I watching? Because it was a little blurred, and I couldn't clearly see it. And then next thing you know, there are 3 guys on the ground, and all of a sudden this missile hits them, and everything is blown up. And my colleagues were laughing, and I just really got equally, doubly scared. And this power, I didn't know what to say. I had no words to say. And at the same time, if I did protest and said something, I thought, would I be seen as a traitor within the mix of my colleagues in the military? And so I let that be. And the other time in the conversation we were having, we were looking at Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we had a large conference. And this one woman who grew up in the Pakistan region, borders Afghanistan, she went and visited her family, and she was one of our speakers. And she said, the women and children are scared when they hear the buzzing sound. They are traumatized, and I'm not, and she was really sad and sorry for her people, and at the same time, she was born in Pakistan, an American citizen, and at the same time also working to try to build understanding and peaceful relationships. So speeding it up, I retired from the military in 2014, and I literally walked away from everything military for my own well-being. I didn't listen to the news. I didn't have a need to. Nobody consulted me, needed my opinion, and I just had to go dark for self-preservation. When I was asked to speak at this event, I said, I'm always asking, what can one person do? And what can I do? But I do realize the power of one person and the voice, and because we never know who will listen to us and who will be connected with whomever that has a stronger voice than mine. So I accepted to speak here. And I also find it difficult when I have to represent the 1.7 billion Muslims, and I have to defend them, and I have to go and tell them stop the war and play nice and so forth. But there's a whole lot more that I'd love to share with you, and other details in more details if you have religious conversation questions. But by all means, please do ask them. And so I feel the Muslim world, or there isn't such a thing, but I'm just going to, the Muslim majority population, it does feel like there's this war against East-West or Christianity against Islam. These are all talks within the communities. And so how do we, my thing is, how do we bring good people, faith-abiding people from all religions together and start to speak out? And that, for me, has not been showing up in the United States as a mass movement of the citizens and people of faith. And you know, right after 9/11, when I was at a UU church doing an interfaith gathering, and this 70-something-year-old man walked in and he says, "I am so upset someone called me a traitor because I was defending, I was saying, why are we going to war so quickly?" And that really struck me, that I felt our voices as faith communities have died down on 9/11.